Imagine you own a farm. Imagine it's been in your family for generations. You speak the king's language. You follow his laws. You even pay his taxes. And then one day a man arrives with a piece of paper claiming that the thing you thought you owned, your house, isn't actually yours all along. All because 60 years ago, your grandfather held it under the wrong type of deed. You have three options. You leave, you pay someone else to rent your previously owned land, or you fight back. But this is not hypothetical. This was the legal reality for many Catholic Irish people in the 1630s. And the system that created this reality, the plantation system, wasn't designed to create a stable Ireland. It was designed to extract land, rents, compliance, identity. And it could only keep functioning if it kept taking more. The 1641 Irish Rebellion is usually told as a story of Catholic savagery, a sudden eruption of sectarian violence. But what if the real story is a bit more mechanical, structural than that? What if the plantation system was a machine that could only run in one direction? And rebellion wasn't a surprise, it was the only possible outcome. Spoiler, that's exactly what it was. To understand why Ireland exploded in 1641, you need to understand the deal they were offered decades before. Because it sounded reasonable. It sounded like a path forward, and that's exactly what made it a trap. The English crown had a problem in Ireland. Gaelic chiefs held land through a system that didn't look anything like English law. There were no deeds. The eldest son didn't automatically inherit. Leadership of land passed through a web of family, election, and local law. But from London's perspective, this wasn't a legal system. It was chaos. So the crown did the right thing and offered a deal called surrender and regrant. The idea is very simple on paper. A Gaelic chief surrenders his land to the crown, and the crown grants it back. But now on English feudal terms, with a proper title, a proper deed, and proper inheritance rules. On the surface, it seems really generous, like everything's going to continue basically as it did before, except, as always, check the fine print. Under Irish law, land didn't just pass to the eldest son. It could pass to brothers, nephews, cousins, anyone who the community thought was the best person to do the job. Surrender and regrant replaced all of that, with the eldest son inheriting everything, just like in England. One heir, everyone else cut out. You're talking cousins, nephews, extended family, people that had a claim in the past, that might have seen their hard work rewarded with some land. And now they're out of the picture. Just like that. Not through a loss of a war, but just through a legal, clerical decision. But that wasn't the only catch. The deed you got back wasn't quite like the one you had before either. It was English freehold land, governed by English rules, which meant that any future disputes over this land would be settled in English courts, by English judges, with English laws. You traded an old regime where everyone around you understood the system. Everyone knew their place and what the possibilities were. And now, a lawyer in Dublin could just strike away your property without you really knowing what happened. And this is the part that matters. The families who refused the deal, they lost their land. It's kind of obvious. If a conquering government is saying that you have to take this deal and we'll do everything nicely and give you everything back, so they lose their land. But the thing is, the people who accept the deal still lose their land, just on an incredibly slower timeline. Because over the decades, every new administration could find a flaw with the deed. Or they may find that the crown had a claim all along. They didn't need to regrant it. It was theirs. Or better yet, that the deed didn't meet a standard that didn't exist at the time, but now exists. No grandfathering in, saying that that was fine at the time, so therefore it's still valid. They can just make it invalid by changing the law. And slowly but surely, that's what happened. So compliance with these rules didn't protect you in the long run anyway. They just changed the terms of your eviction when it finally came. So the first thing to understand about the plantation system is that it wasn't a land grab disguised as law. It was a legal framework where land loss was the only realistic outcome, whether you played along or not. The question was never if you will lose your land. It was a case of when and how politely it happened. And you may think that's just a design flaw and that someone will come along and rectify the problems. But now we need to meet the man who turned this into official policy. In 1633, Thomas Wentworth arrived in Ireland as Lord Deputy. His job, in theory, is to govern. In reality, his job was to make Ireland profitable for the crown. And he was fantastically good at it, in the same way that a loan shark is great at finance. Wentworth inherently understood something that the previous administrators only stumbled upon. Land titles in Ireland were a mess. Decades of surrender and regrant, incomplete surveys, overlapping titles, and shifting legal standards meant that almost no one's titles were clean. But that wasn't a problem for Wentworth. His business model depended on that. He began systematically finding crown claims to land, going back generations, finding any gap in the claim, and then using that to take ownership. It didn't matter if a family had held the land for a century or two. It didn't matter if you'd been a loyal subject. If Wentworth and his lawyers could find a flaw, and they almost always could, then your land was in trouble. Now the Old English. They are the descendants of the old Norman settlers. Catholic, but deeply loyal to the crown. English-speaking, integrated into the legal system. Perfect citizens. They had done everything right. They had paid their taxes. They'd served in local government. They weren't Gaelic rebels hiding in the hills. They had done everything right. But the mistake they made is that Wentworth didn't care whether you were loyal or a good Catholic or a bad Catholic. He challenged land titles whenever they became available. Loyalty was irrelevant. What mattered was whether the claim could be broken. And if it could be broken, could the crown make money on it? And this is where a little feedback loop starts to kick in. One that meant rebellion was well on its way. The more land Wentworth seized, the more money the crown made. The more revenue he made, the more London backed his methods. The more London backed his methods, the less anyone else could do to stop him. He was rewarded in every way for every acre he took from other people. Who was going to stop him? The Irish Parliament? He had them under his thumb. The king? Charles I was famously desperate for money, and he loved the results that Wentworth was giving him. The courts? Well, Wentworth appointed the judges, of course. And this is exactly what a blocked feedback loop looks like. The people being harmed had no way of doing anything about it. No institution would hear from them. And they had no ally in power who wasn't making money from their dispossession. Now, I'm pinning all of this on Wentworth, but it's a bit bigger than him, right? Now, Wentworth wasn't a rogue operator. He was using the system exactly as it was designed. The English way of governing Ireland required extraction to fund it. All Wentworth did, really, is turn the efficiency up a few notches. But he was ruthlessly efficient, and that is important. That efficiency meant that land was being stripped quicker than people could adapt. A big backlog of people who had been stripped of land very quickly was building up behind him. All this meant the pressure had nowhere to go except underground. But there was one moment, one window of opportunity, where the system almost corrected itself. And what happened to that little window tells us everything we need to know about why the rebellion became inevitable. In the late 1620s, the Catholic population of Ireland, Old English and Gaelic Irish alike, were offered a deal. It was called the Graces, and for a brief moment it looked like the system might bend before it broke. Now, the Graces were a set of concessions negotiated between the Catholic gentry and the crown. The terms are pretty simple. Catholics would have to pay substantial subsidies to the king, hard cash up front, and in return they'd receive security of titles, relief from civil disabilities, and an end to the legal harassment that was destroying their lives. These weren't radical ideas. They weren't asking for independence. They weren't even asking for the plantations to be reversed. They asked for the rules to stop changing under their feet. To just have a deal, get it over with, pay the money, and move on with life. They were asking for the deals they'd already made to be honoured. Surrender and regrant, purchase titles, negotiated settlements. All of that to just stay in place. Nothing more. The crown said yes and pocketed the subsidies. Job done. Then in 1634, the Irish Parliament convened. Wentworth was in charge, naturally. He opened the first session promising to revive the Graces, to finally pass them into law. Catholics in the Parliament voted him the subsidies he needed. And then the second session happened. And Wentworth blocked the Graces entirely. He'd used the promise of reform to get more money, and then he killed the reform. The subsidies were spent, the Graces were dead, and the Catholic population had just learned in the most explicit way possible that the crown would take their money and give them nothing in return. But he didn't stop there. In 1639, Wentworth imposed the Black Oath on Ulster, forcing settlers, including Scottish Presbyterians, to swear loyalty and reject the Scottish Covenant. He pushed forwards with plans to turn Connaught, the last place without the plantation system, into a plantation, the last major region where Catholic landholders still held sway. And when the Irish Parliament tried to get some independence from the rule that meant all laws passed in Ireland had to get royal approval, the king shut that down too. In 1640, the Irish Parliament sent an official remonstrance to the English Parliament. It detailed the abuses, the broken promises. It asked for a solution through proper channels. Nothing happened. This is the turning point. Every legal method of doing something had been shut down. Negotiation. The Graces were betrayed almost immediately. The Irish Parliament, largely controlled by Wentworth. Petitions to the English Parliament. They were ignored. The courts were stacked against them. The Catholic population of Ireland had spent 2 decades trying to work within the system to get their land recognised and to have a fair, legal framework. The system took everything they wanted. The system took everything they offered and gave them fuck all in response. The Graces weren't really a failed policy. They were really a proof of concept. Proof that the system would never voluntarily stop extracting. After all the dead ends, it wasn't because the people were naive that everything failed. It's just that no one in the system had a good reason to do what they needed them to do. Honouring the land titles meant less revenue. Less revenue meant less power for the king. The king who was about to fight a civil war. Neither him nor anyone else in power was about to willingly give up any money or power themselves. There was no safety valve and the pressure kept mounting. So when the explosion finally came in 1641, it isn't a question of why. It's what the people in power expected to happen as a result of what they did. On the night of October 22nd, 1641, armed Irish Catholics started seizing strongholds all across Ulster. Within weeks, Protestant settlers were being driven from their homes, stripped of their possessions, and in many cases killed. This is the part of the story that English propaganda will always make sure you hear. What it made sure you wouldn't hear is equally important. But we'll start with what actually happened, because the reality is bad enough without any embellishment. The rebellion was planned as a coordinated seizure of key assets. It was an attempted coup, effectively, and led by the same Gaelic lords that had lost their property and fought against the system and all the changes that had happened in the previous decades. It was planned as a swift political action, but it didn't stay that way. As the uprising spread, it became chaotic. Settlers were being kicked out of their homes in the middle of autumn. Thousands of people were stripped of their belongings and their clothes and just thrown out onto the road with nowhere to go. In County Armagh alone, around 1,300 people were killed, around a quarter of the population. Across Ulster and beyond, around 5,000 Protestant settlers were killed in the first months. Thousands more fled to Dublin, Carrickfergus and other fortified towns. This was real. This was devastating for the people involved. And this was also, and I want to be careful with my wording here, not what was told back in England. In England, the stories were a little bit different. Pamphlets flooded the streets of London claiming that 154,000 settlers had been butchered. Others claimed that as many as 200,000 had been killed. A pamphlet called Worse and Worse News from Ireland described children being boiled alive and pregnant women being ripped open. None of this was designed to inform. This was designed to horrify, to dehumanise the Irish Catholic population. I wonder who does this in the modern world. Around 5,000 actual deaths become 200,000 in England. A deeply political rebellion born from decades of mistreatment, when told in England, was described as an act of unexpected savagery. And here's why the exaggeration mattered. Those numbers weren't just propaganda. They were vital for what would come next. Witness testimonies are taken years after the events, often from people who have got a financial interest in what comes next. Because of course, the creators of this system didn't just rest on their laurels as everything fell apart. They saw opportunity, and it needed the rebellion to be as monstrous as possible to justify what came next. The 1641 rebellion was real, and the effects were real, but the version that entered the English memory was a manufactured product, inflated, because the system that created the rebellion now needed to use the horror of the rebellion to justify the next phase. The machine didn't break in 1641. It went into a higher gear. In 1642, the English Parliament passed the Act for Adventurers. And if you want to know what the plantation system really was, not the ideology, not the religion, just the mechanics, this is where the mask comes off completely. In effect, the Act of Adventurers was very simple. Private investors, or adventurers, could put up money to fund the reconquest of Ireland. And in return for that money, they'd receive land. That land was going to come from the Irish Catholics that had just rebelled and previously held the land. But only once the rebellion was crushed. The land hadn't been conquered yet, the war hadn't been won, but already the land was being sold. Parliament was selling Irish land to English investors in the same way that joint stock ventures at the same time were selling part of the colonial pie. It's literally the same thing. Because the people running this weren't strangers to colonialisation. Providence Island Company, which funded English colonial investments in the Caribbean, was led by John Pym, the Earl of Warwick, and Lord Brooke. These same people were very influential in English parliamentary politics and very crucial in what was going to happen in Ireland. Sir John Clotworthy, one of the biggest planters in Ulster, was a key parliamentary ally of Pym's. The same investors, the same legal frameworks, the same logic. Use private capital to fund conquest, pay the returns in confiscated land, and transport the losers, Irish rebels, English loyalists, doesn't matter, to the Caribbean to work as indentured workers. Ireland wasn't a unique case, but it was a prototype. The plantation model, invest, conquer, confiscate, plant, extract, was all a portable system. It worked in Ulster, it worked in Munster, and the men who refined it in Ireland took it to Virginia, to the Caribbean, to anywhere that land could be taken, repackaged, and sold as a financial instrument. The 1641 rebellion didn't end the plantation system. It only accelerated it. The moral justification came from the violence, from the rebellion, justified by those inflated numbers. Remember them from the pamphlets. The Act for Adventurers provided the finance. Violence created the opportunity. Investment funded the response. Confiscation paid the dividends. This is what the plantation system actually was. Not a policy of settlement. It was a machine that turned political instability into hard cash. It kind of needed instability to function, because without any rebellion, there was no real justification for confiscation. And without confiscation, there were no returns on people's investments. The system didn't fail in 1641. It did exactly what it was meant to do. It just needed the people inside it to break first. Which brings us to the question this whole story has been building towards. The question, was the 1641 rebellion inevitable? Not morally. The moral answer is pretty obvious, I think. I mean mechanically. Given how the system was built, was any other outcome possible? This was a vicious cycle. Any kind of resistance would result in more confiscation. Confiscation would result in more resistance. Your resistance would be misrepresented, turned into savagery, used to justify taking your land, even to kill you. Every time confiscations happened, people were displaced. People became rebels. When rebels came about, they needed to be got rid of. Once you got rid of them, you replaced them with more settlers. You had more settlers who wanted to take land. You needed to find some people to get rid of. The cycle continues. So could the system have stopped? Could someone have said, you know what, lads, we've got enough land? No. But here's why. The Crown needed revenue, and Wentworth's career depended on delivering it. The settlers needed security, which meant pushing the Catholics further from their borders. The investors needed returns, which meant more land had to come onto the market. And the Catholic population, the people living with these consequences, needed the one thing the system would never give them. Security that what was theirs today would be theirs tomorrow. The Graces were that guarantee. That was blocked. Petitions to the English Parliament were ignored. The Irish Parliament was that guarantee. It was controlled. The courts were that guarantee. And they were in Wentworth's pockets. Any mechanism that could be used by the people that were being controlled was either taken away by those in power or just turned off completely. No one ever sat down and said, let's make a rebellion inevitable. But instead, something more important happened. Every person in that chain acted in their own self-interest, which almost guaranteed the same outcome. Charles I, the king, Wentworth, investors, settlers. And every one of those rational decisions made the final explosion even larger. The 1641 rebellion wasn't a failure of the plantation system. It was from the very beginning designed to explode. The only question was when. And the people who built the system, well, they didn't learn any lessons. They took that same blueprint. Invest, conquer, confiscate, plant, and extract. And they used it again, and again, and again, and again, and again, morphing into one of the biggest empires ever seen. Every time they expected stability as a result. And every time they found the opposite. For example, one of those places is Jamaica 200 years later, the same empire. Here again, we see another rebellion and another feedback loop. And watch this to see how everything turned out. Bye!